For Polity in Johannesburg, I am Darlene Creamer. Author and architect John Stewart joins me to discuss the biography of Sir Herbert Baker, whose architectural legacy is deeply embedded in South Africa. His work can be seen in private homes, public buildings, churches, schools, the Union buildings in Pretoria, and St. George's Cathedral and Groote in Cape Town. To start, John, could you share some insights into Herbert Baker's early life in England and what led him to South Africa?
Yeah, sure. I'd be delighted to. Sir Herbert was born in Kent in the southeast of England. His father was quite a wealthy landowner, and Herbert went to a private school, and he actually excelled at sports when he was there. He was captain of football, captain of cricket, but also interestingly, he was very keen on literature and poetry and the arts, so quite a range of interests, really. But he moved on from there to towards the end of his career at school. He decided that he was going to go into architecture, and he went to work first of all for his elder cousin, who had a very successful architectural practice in London, and then progressed from there to the office of Ernest George, who was one of the top architects in the UK at the time. So very good architectural grounding. But then he'd just left Ernest George to start up his own practice and was really struggling for work to get his first commissions and get going. And that same time, his younger brother, Lionel, came back from the Cape with tales of the extraordinary wealth that could be made in fruit farming. And by that time, the Baker's family farms were really struggling with an agricultural depression in the UK. And so they decided to invest in fruit farming. And because Lionel was the young son, Herbert was the older, they asked Herbert simply to go to Cape Town to invest the family wealth in a fruit farm here in Cape Town itself. So that's how he arrived. He wasn't pursuing his architectural career.
You were granted access to a wealth of letters and documents from Baker's family, which provided a unique perspective into his architectural projects and personal relationships. Can you talk about the significance of this access and highlight some of the letters and projects that stood out?
I'd be delighted to, yeah. I mean, I already had quite a lot of research information when I started writing the book, but I thought it'd be a good idea if I could try and track down Baker's family and see if they had any more personal documentation. And so I met his eldest grandson, Michael Baker, went down to his house in Bristol, and he said, well, come and see what I've got. And we went up a couple of floors in his house, and I expected maybe a couple of family albums, instead of which there was this entire room full of files. And Michael just said, well, where do you want to start? I've got all the letters from Cape Town back to his brother. I've got all the letters from New Delhi back to his wife, and from his European tour to his mother. Absolutely extraordinary. And I just spent day after day after day down in Bristol going through these letters. I'm the first person to have had access to all of that, and I quote quite a lot of the letters in the book, and I think, I hope that brings the story alive, really, rather than it just being a straight architectural biography. I mean, interesting, when he was working in New Delhi with Edwin Lutyens, I'd already seen Lutyens' letters writing home complaining about Herbert Baker, and now I had Herbert Baker's letter writing home to his wife complaining about Edwin Lutyens. So absolutely fascinating stuff.
Baker was closely tied to the British Empire, and as you say in the book, from our 21st century post-colonial perspective, his views on race and gender would be regarded as problematic. Could you elaborate on this? And how should readers today understand and judge the views of people who lived in a different time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was one of the things in writing the book I really struggled with, to actually get my head into the general thought patterns of kind of 19th century South Africa and London. Because, yeah, the values were completely different from our 21st century values. They were racist, xenophobic, all of that, and that was normal. So, Baker, even though he had a close relationship with Rhodes and Milner and so on, was just typical of your average educated, young British man who believed that continually expanding the British Empire was to the benefit of the world. They saw it as a positive thing. It was bringing civilization, right across the world, and Christianity with it. So it was actually a mission they were on. It wasn't just a case of seeking out gold and diamonds and all of that, which, of course came too. They really did believe in what they were trying to achieve. And it's very difficult to get your head around that. And the other thing I found really interesting was even in 1900 and shortly after, they thought the British Empire would last forever. They still thought that, that the sun would never set. And in fact, Baker building a new imperial capital in New Delhi from where the British would rule, was intended to last for the next 500 years. And then in reality, 12 years later, from the Viceroy moving in for the first time, it was the President of India who was occupying the buildings. So it's very difficult to get your head around that. But, those were the common values and views then. And, they're radically different from now.
Baker enjoyed friendships with people like Cecil Rhodes, Rudyard Kipling, Jan Smuts. Can you reflect on these relationships for Baker as an architect and personally?
Yeah, sure. I mean, he had an extraordinary range of friendships. When he first started working for Rhodes, it was very much architect and client. But after the fire at Schuur, he actually moved to a house on the edge of the estate to supervise the rebuilding. And when Rhodes was there, because he spent a lot of time up country, but when he was there, he and Baker actually got to know each other very well. Baker, idolized Rhodes. He was a hero of the empire. But for Rhodes, he was fascinated by Baker, this very well-educated, well-read Englishman. He had all the education that Rhodes had lacked and missed. So the two got on very well. And then, of course, when Lord Milner invited Baker up to Johannesburg to start to design the civic buildings there, he got to know Milner's kindergarten and developed a whole range of friendships there with Robert Brand and John Buchan and Lionel Hitchens, which again just continued throughout his whole life. And then also got to know Jan Smuts, and they became friends and corresponded throughout their lives. And in fact, visited the United States together about 20 years later. And then there's these extraordinary other people. Rudyard Kipling, he knew well. And incredibly, Lawrence of Arabia, he got to know very well. And in fact, Lawrence stayed in the flat above Baker's London office secretly to avoid the press while writing Seven Pillars. So astonishing range of friendships, which were maintained through letters, many of which I was able to read. So just amazing guy, really.
So Baker's career took him across the world with projects in South Africa, England, India, Kenya, and Australia. In India, he collaborated with architect Edward Litchens, though their relationship was often tense. Can you shed light on his time in India, where he designed the Indian Parliament, and his complex dynamic with Litchens?
Yes, I mean, the two of them had known each other almost all their adult lives. They'd worked together as assistants in Ernest George's office in London. And then when Baker went to Cape Town, first of all, in Johannesburg, they carried on writing and really had quite a close friendship, albeit partly successful because they weren't competitors together. And then when the opportunity of New Delhi arose, the new imperial capital, Litchens was very well connected in London, so was an early shoe-in, really. But Baker suddenly, having completed the Union buildings, also seemed like an automatic candidate. And the fact that the two of them knew each other and could work together seemed very attractive. And so they did, work together as partners for the first time, and it didn't take long before they fell out, because it was 20 years since they'd both been young assistants. They both had substantial achievements and egos, and as I say, it didn't really go that well. They had a big bust up and disagreement about halfway through the project. And it actually got to the point where they didn't speak to each other for 5 years, despite the fact they were sharing an office in Delhi. So things got really, really difficult. But regardless of all that, what they achieved in Delhi was extraordinary.
One of his greatest achievements in South Africa was his design of the Union buildings, which since 1910 have continued to be the offices of the South African presidency for over 100 years. Can you share more about Baker's work on the Union buildings and what makes it so significant?
Sure. I mean, I think it's one of his best buildings of all. I mean, he was involved in selecting the site, and he went for the hillside site really because of the drama that that could bring to the buildings, and he fully exploited. So it's a fascinating design. I mean, symbolically, you have the two wings representing the English and the Dutch come together and then joined with the great arc of colonnade that encloses the amphitheatre. And actually, when he saw the hillside, there was already a stone quarry there in the centre, and that's what inspired him really to place an amphitheatre right in the centre of the building as a symbol of democracy and open government and speech. So he really symbolised the coming together of the two races in the building, and then just created a wonderful series of office spaces which are still effective and in use today. And then tumbling down the hill, this cascade of terraces that go on down and into the park. And I mean, it's a real tribute to him, not only that the buildings are still operational, but also that I understand they're still a great symbol of South Africa.
That was John Stewart discussing his biography, Sir Herbert Baker.